Welcome back to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and I want to start with a question that sounds simple and isn't. What is your brain actually for? Most of us carry an unexamined answer. We assume the brain is for figuring out what's true, that it's a truth finding organ, and that when it gets things wrong, something has malfunctioned. It's a flattering story. It's also, according to the research, not quite right. And the gap between that story and the reality explains an enormous amount about why people, including you and me, hold on to beliefs long after the evidence has walked out of the room. Because evolution never optimized your brain for truth. It optimized your brain for acting well enough, fast enough, cheaply enough to stay alive. Truth got included only when truth happened to help. That's our stride today. First, what the brain was actually built for and why certainty is so much more valuable to it than accuracy. Then the machinery of belief and the specific gates that decide whether evidence gets to count. Then the finding that genuinely unsettled me about what your brain does with information it doesn't want. And finally, what to do about all of it, because there is something to do, and it's smaller and stranger than you'd expect. Let's take the first step. Start with evolution, and let's be honest about the design brief. Your nervous system was not built by a committee of philosophers. It was built by a process that cared about one thing, which is whether your ancestors survived long enough to have children. And a brain that pursued perfect truth would have been a catastrophe for that project. Truth is slow. Truth is expensive. Truth requires you to sit in doubt while you gather more data. And the ancestor who paused to gather more data about the rustling in the grass did not become anybody's ancestor. So, what the research suggests is that brains are shaped by trade offs: performance against energy cost, speed against accuracy, robustness against flexibility. No biological system can be optimal at everything, so evolution finds compromises. And one critique of the whole brain as perfect statistician idea puts it bluntly: evolution favors robustness, speed, and metabolic efficiency over statistical elegance. Being right is nice. Being right in time at a price you can afford is what actually mattered, which reframes what the brain is really doing. It isn't primarily a truth tracker, it's an uncertainty manager. Its job is to reduce the unbearable state of not knowing quickly enough to act. And I want to give you one piece of evidence for how far it will go to do that, because it stopped me cold. When people lose a sense, the brain sometimes generates a phantom limb pain, tinnitus, that ringing when the ear has gone quiet. And one interpretation of that phenomenon is that the brain, deprived of input, fills in the missing signal to resolve the unbearable open question. Rather than sit with a gap where information should be, it will manufacture something to put there. Let that sink in. Your brain would rather invent than not know. Now let's look at how a belief actually gets updated, because there's a mechanism here and it's beautiful and a little brutal. If you heard the last episode, you know the basic architecture. Your brain holds predictions about the world, and when reality disagrees, that mismatch generates a signal called a prediction error. That error is what drives learning. But here's the crucial part we didn't fully explore. Not every error is treated equally. The brain assigns each one a weight. Researchers call this precision, which is basically the confidence score attached to a piece of information. So belief updating comes down to a contest. On one side is how certain you already are, on the other is how much you trust the new evidence. And you update only when the evidence wins, which means that strong prior beliefs don't just compete with contrary evidence, they can suppress it. If your existing certainty is weighted heavily enough, incoming information that should have changed everything can arrive and simply not count. And this is where it gets personal, because there are specific gates that decide whether evidence gets through. And once you know them, you'll see them operating in yourself. The first gate is confidence, and this is one of my favorite findings in psychology, in the way that a punch to the stomach can be your favorite. Researchers looked at what happens in the brain after a person commits to a decision, and they found that high confidence selectively enhances the processing of evidence that confirms the choice, while essentially abolishing the processing of evidence that contradicts it. Read that again: not reduces, abolishes. Once you're sure, the disconfirming evidence stops being processed as evidence at all. Confidence isn't the result of having weighed everything. Confidence is the thing that decides what gets weighed. The second gate is trust in the source, which sounds reasonable and mostly is. Evidence changes your beliefs only if you consider the messenger credible. But notice what that permits. If you can find a reason to distrust the source, you can neutralize any fact it carries without ever engaging the fact itself. And we are all extremely good at finding reasons. The third gate is identity, and this is the one with teeth. Beliefs are not only tools for accuracy, beliefs carry value. They tell you who you are, they tie you to your people, they hold your world steady. So, what happens when evidence threatens a belief that's load bearing? There's brain imaging on this, and it's remarkable. When people were confronted with counter evidence to their political beliefs, the activity didn't look like careful reasoning. It looked like a threat response with increased activity in the network associated with self referential thought, that inward turning system that hums when you think about who you are. In other words, the brain turned away from the external evidence and toward the self. Another study of politically committed people found that threatening information lit up emotional and self relevant regions rather than the regions we associate with cold, deliberate reasoning. Motivated reasoning, in that light, is not really thinking at all. It looks more like emotion regulation wearing the costume of thought. You are not weighing the argument, you are soothing yourself and building the argument afterward to explain why you feel better. And there's a detail in that research I find quietly devastating. The people who did change their minds showed less activity in the brain's alarm and emotion regions while they evaluated the counter evidence, which suggests that changing your mind may be less about intelligence than about how threatened you feel. The person who can update is often just the person who is not, in that moment, terrified. Now, here comes the finding that unsettled me most, and I want to build it carefully. You might assume that when someone ignores evidence, they simply didn't see it, that the information failed to get in. But researchers looked at the brain during exactly this kind of moment, and what they found was worse than that. Disconfirming evidence was encoded precisely and accurately in the sensory processing regions of the cortex. The brain registered it. It was in there, correctly represented, and yet it contributed very little to the behavior when it conflicted with a choice the person had already made. So the information wasn't blocked at the door, it was let in, seen clearly, and then quietly ignored on the way to the decision. Your brain saw it. Your brain declined to use it. That to me is the real portrait of the mind we're all walking around with, not a fortress that keeps out inconvenient truths, but something more like a well run office where the memo arrives, gets read, and never makes it into the meeting. Now, before this tips into despair, I owe you two important pieces of context because the honest picture is more forgiving than it sounds. The first is that a lot of this is not stupidity, and it isn't even irrationality in the way we usually mean. Researchers have shown that confirmation bias can emerge naturally from a reasonable shortcut, from a brain trying to approximate good reasoning while working with limited memory and limited computation. It's what you get when a finite system tries to be sensible on a budget. Your bias is not proof that you're a fool. It's the price of being made of meat and running in real time. The second is that some resistance is genuinely useful. A brain that updated its worldview every time something surprising happened would be unusable. You'd be blown around by every rumor, every outlier, every bad night. Stability is a feature. In fact, one study found that people ignore a substantial share of weak sensory input specifically to avoid changing their minds without good reason. That's not a flaw, that's a filter, and you'd be a mess without it. So the problem was never that we resist. The problem is when we resist and how we can't feel the difference from the inside. Which brings me to what all this costs, because it isn't only about being wrong. Your relationship to uncertainty shapes your entire life, and the research shows it in ways that are almost startling in how concrete they are. People with a high need to resolve uncertainty quickly, what researchers call need for cognitive closure, tend to prefer others who are similar to them, and they end up with smaller and less diverse discussion networks. Think about that chain. An intolerance for not knowing, sitting quietly inside a person, gradually curates their entire social world down to people who will never surprise them. The discomfort becomes a wall, and the wall becomes a life. And in professionals, poor tolerance for uncertainty predicts higher work stress, not because their jobs are objectively harder, because not knowing itself is what hurts. Then there's what happens under pressure. Stress appears to speed up how fast we commit to a conclusion while amplifying the biases we already had. It pushes us toward black and white thinking, toward that hard, brittle certainty that feels like clarity and is usually just fear wearing clarity's clothes, which is worth knowing because it means the moments when you feel most certain may be exactly the moments when your certainty is worth least. Researchers also describe something they call belief traps, and the phrase is exact. Repeated activation, social reinforcement, and echo chambers deepen a belief until it becomes a kind of valley the mind keeps rolling into, and their finding about how you get out matters enormously. Escape usually requires repeated exposure to counter evidence over time, not one devastating fact, not the perfect argument you've been rehearsing in the shower to finally win the family dinner. I want to sit with that for a moment because I think it's the most useful, practical truth in this episode. If you have been trying to change someone's mind with one knockout argument and it hasn't worked, and you've concluded they must be stupid or dishonest, the research offers a different explanation. That's simply not how minds change. You brought a single fact to a system that updates through repetition, trust, and safety, and then you delivered it in a way that made them feel attacked, which raised the exact defenses that stop evidence from counting. You didn't fail to make a good argument. You misunderstood what an argument even does. So let me bring us home and offer you the small, strange, actually supported thing you can do. Here's a finding I love for how modest it is. Confidence depends not only on the strength of the evidence, but on how much time the decision took. Slower decisions produce lower certainty, and lower certainty means more openness to revision, which gives us something absurdly simple. Wait, not forever, just longer than feels necessary. That extra beat before you conclude, before you decide what she meant by that text, before you're sure how the meeting went, before you're certain what kind of person he is not wasted time. It is the mechanical difference between a mind that can still be reached and a mind that has already sealed. And here's what I most want you to carry out of this one. Certainty is a feeling. It is not a measurement of truth. It arrives before the evidence is done. It grows under stress precisely when it's least warranted, and it quietly switches off your ability to process anything that disagrees with it. That confident, settled, I just know feeling in your chest is not your brain telling you that you're right. It's your brain telling you it has stopped looking. So the practice is not to become a person without beliefs. That's neither possible nor good. The practice is to notice the feeling of certainty and treat it as information about your state rather than about the world, to hold the door open a little longer than is comfortable, to let the memo make it into the meeting. Your brain will always prefer certainty to being right. That's what it was built for, and you can't rewire the design, but you can learn to recognize the feeling for what it is. And in that small recognition, in that half second of, wait, maybe I'm just sure not correct, is where almost everything worth learning has room to get in. That's the stride from certainty towards something you can actually use. Thanks for walking it with me. I'm Esther Adams. This has been Strides to Solutions, and I'll see you next time.